We are delighted to have one of our very own, Catherine Tuhirirwe, who is presenting a very exciting seminar on the impact of Chinese investment loans on sustainable economic development in Africa. What did we know? What have we learned? This is absolutely interesting, covering a huge area. But before I do that, let me first introduce Catherine. Catherine has been very active in these seminars, in a way, as a participant on the other side of the spectrum, commenting on papers, listening to the papers, but also seriously undertaking her own research. She's now a second-year PhD researcher in the School of Finance and Management here at SOAS, University of London. And her research interfaces interesting aspects in economics, in development, in finance and law, and all being brought together to examine interesting aspects of Chinese investment loans in Africa. At the moment, as we speak, she's currently a visiting researcher at the main think tank in Uganda, which is called the Economic Policy Research Center, the main think tank, a knowledge intermediary linking researchers to policymakers. And her research interests are centered around international finance, public investment, financial law, and it's used to do with the budgetary considerations and implications of investment for debt and for transparency in investment. And what she's presenting here is indeed a big component of her doctoral thesis on investigating various macro and developmental aspects of Chinese loans in Africa. She holds a master's in finance and financial law, also from SOAS, University of London. And the spirit of this presentation is to excite comments, feedback, suggestions, interactions, through the usual cut and thrust of academic life, which should be able to enhance this work to already the high quality that it has attained, and also be able to chart the way forward in terms of very promising research ideas that will continue to occupy Catherine for the next couple of years, and whereafter, even after her doctoral degree. So, Catherine, you are most welcome to the presentation today. Take your time and share with us your ideas. And then for the participants, please post your comments, suggestions, questions in the chat, or you can hold the fire, and then at the end of the presentation, we shall ask you to share your ideas. So, Catherine, you are welcome. We give you a hand of applause, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Murinde. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to be here. This is my first presentation indeed on such a big platform, so I hope I do you proud. So I'm looking into the impact of Chinese investment loans on sustainable economic development in Africa. And I'm looking at what we know currently in the literature review that's circulating amongst us as scholars. So this is a roadmap of how I'll be presenting. I'll look at the research motivation, go through the introduction, discuss the theoretical frameworks that are underpinning this study, the methodology that I've used to come up with the literature review, and then I'll look at different strands of literature and look at the impact of Chinese investments in Africa, and conclude and get some feedback from me afterwards. So to introduce the topic, there's currently increasing debt in Africa, and it's been recently increasing, which is leading to dependency issues, mainly to China, but also to multilateral organizations. Most worryingly, indeed, is the new players that have come into the loans market, which are the commercial lenders, and these tend to have slightly higher interest rates than the going market rate. We see an example there, the China Development Bank gave a loan to Zambia that was at a 4.5% margin, yet naturally it should be about 3.5%. So of course, all this leads to increased costs of debt financing. The other issue is bilateral negotiations, as it is each country negotiates with China depending on what sort of funding they need. And some of these countries are not really in a position to negotiate favorably. And last but not least is the fact that academic literature on this topic is still low in impactful journals. And in fact, Brotigam, who is one of the leading scholars in this area, only 2020 called for more research so we can understand the Sino-African relations better. And to introduce literally what's China and Africa have been going through in the last few years. They started their relations in 1950s, and this has continued to grow, but more especially from 2000, since the inauguration of the Forum on China-African Cooperation, as well as the inception of the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. So these investments have continued to grow, and funding has gone to many countries, and we see that by 2018, Usman says that China's outstanding and disbursed debt to Africa amounted to 493 billion. And some of this that's public and publicly guaranteed amounted to 365 billion. As it is, Chinese lending is still steady in Africa, but we see from 2019 it started declining. It might have been due to the pressure that had amounted to China, or maybe it was indeed the fact that African governments are realizing that the debt is becoming unsustainable. That could be the reasons why it's declining. We see that most of this trade is coming in form of construction, infrastructure projects, and these are usually funded by investment loans from China. And the main funders in the market are the China Exim Bank, China Development Bank, the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, as well as the Bank of China. From the statistics so far, what we can see, compare China's public debt to these countries in comparison to their gross national income, we see that many of them are kind of doing okay, but bear in mind these statistics are of June 2020. So many countries are around probably now about the 30 to 40% mark of Chinese debt in comparison to their public debt. And if you go to how much their general national income, if you compare that to the debt servicing, some of them are going as high as 20%, with like the three of them at the top here, Djibouti, Angola, going as high as 30%, which is quite high for some of these economies, especially the fact that there's not that much economic activities that will bring in this much income. And on the pictures here, we have examples of some of the structures and investment projects that Chinese governments have undertaken. On the top left, we see an Isimba plant in Uganda. Top right, we see the standard gauge railway in Nairobi, Kenya. Bottom left, we have a children's hospital in Senegal. And the bottom right is the Kenneth Kaunda International Airport. So impressive projects, but the handling of the debts could be another issue. So we talk about the theoretical underpinnings for this study, and the idea behind Chinese loans is that the production function is what gears these investments, and we highlight three main forms to help with our study. And the first one is the Cobb-Douglas function, whereby output depends on the levels of capital and labor that are inputted. And the higher the inputs, the higher, of course, the outputs. And we have the constant A, which explains any other factors that are not explained by the capital and labor that's inputted. And to add on to that, we have the alliative production model, which says that with strictly complementary factors of the production model, if you input capital and labor in equal proportions, your derive indeed equal measures of output at Q. And this, of course, is helpful for like the projects that we see coming out of these investments. And lastly, we also have the constant elasticity of substitution, which is another production function, which also assumes that output will change in constant terms to the inputs of capital and labor. And so we go forward to say that with the production function in Africa, really, what drives growth is the human capital. And we look at some growth models, not just human capital, but capital accumulation generally. So we look at Harrod-Domar growth model, which says that for nations to maximize outputs from investments, they have to be maximizing savings and also make sure that the productions are useful enough to indeed bring out useful outputs. But for Africa, as we know, there's not that much capital, so it might not be sufficient enough to actually bring about the economic growth that's needed. And for that, Chenery and Stout improves that model to suggest that actually we can source capital externally. It doesn't have to be from within. And this works for Africa, and this is where we see China coming in. And this is as well enhanced by the AK growth model, which is by Pagano, but then again enhanced by our very own Professor Murinde in 1996. And it says that for economic growth to happen, we also have to have internal factors that contribute to the production process. And we need human capital, we need savings, we need investment, and this will push forward financial development. So China is coming in with the funding as well as giving the expertise. And Africa, of course, we have the projects undertaken and we pay back either in commodities or revenue from the projects. Or sometimes if the revenues are not enough, the treasury as well has to cater for the loan repayments. The other model we're looking at for this study is the game theory. And with game theory, it's a theory that presumes that in a market, in a game really, one player's payoffs are dependent on the other player's strategies. So in this game, we have China and Africa, where China uses the kind of big brother type strategy. And it says, we're out to cooperate with Africa. We're not here to compete with you. And as well, they're using development finance, promoting it as a win-win relationship, which some have indeed agreed that, yes, it's a win-win, others doubt it. So for the bigger majority that doubt it, we see that China is benefiting more from the relationship between itself and Africa. And for this, recently in 2021, Crowther and Saifi came up with an extension of the game theory saying, what if actually you start off at equilibrium, but as you go along, the benefits from one party skew to one side more than the other? And they propose this reducing some game and say, if such a situation happens, we need somebody to oversee this relationship so we can maintain equilibrium at all times. So for this, there might be a proposal maybe to help African countries to kind of put them at an equal footing with China so that they can go negotiate and indeed get mutual benefits. So the methodology that I used for the study, I explored academic literature on Sino-African loan relationships, and I used a number of keywords, as you can see on the screen. But from the analysis, the main phrase that came up with the highest hits was Chinese lending in Africa. And I used Science Direct and Google Scholar for these searches. Looking at the number of articles that have been written about the Sino-African relations, this is from 2001 to date. You can see it's an exponential growth of interest in this topic. And as you can see, some areas where we have like the FOCAC happening in different years, the number of articles goes higher because the interest is higher depending on what China has agreed to undertake in Africa. So it's an area that's still hot and is interesting. And we can only hope that eventually, of course, the relationship is as mutual as possible. So with the methodology, what I saw doing this, I realized is very minimal studies, especially compiling everything that's been written in form of a literature review. The only study that I could find was actually done recently in 2022 by Ding and her colleagues. And they look at Chinese engagement in Africa. And their literature review looks at different strands. So one of them, they're looking at the characterization of the Africa-China relations and how China is perceived as an influential partner and Africa is perceived as lacking agency. But then at the strands as well, look at how China is helping Africa as a developmental partner, coming in with projects that are helping boost Africa's economic growth and development, and they're taking away, they're going away with their debts paid. So this is the only study that I could find that has done this and come up yet again, of course, with mixed results. As we see, the topic is still bringing about mixed results on the benefits of this relationship. And the method that I used was the content configuration analysis, which is an analysis that helps to break down qualitative data, especially in terms of articles, to derive meaningful results and compile them for analysis. So I looked at English published academic literature, and this includes authors from a variety of authors from different backgrounds, but most especially I wanted to add the African voice, since many authors, especially Usman, has said that there is lack of the African voice in this conversation. So I looked at many papers that were written in the last, it's 22 years. And you'll see that in the studies, we include a variety of scholars. We also included the policy reports and working papers. These are especially from influential institutions and their leading experts, as we cannot do without this. Many of them are the ones that have the capability of getting into like governments to get the nitty-gritty of this information, since most of it is usually confidential. And from the existing literature, we discovered a few themes for the reasons, first of all, why China is in Africa. And theme one, we see that there is an investment gap. As it is, the Global Competitiveness Report from the World Economic Forum in 2019 says one of the enabling factors for global competitiveness is infrastructure. And as it is, Africa only scores 45% in infrastructure development. It has the fastest growing population, caters for 1/7 of the world population, but the infrastructure development is still not up to par. So that explains why China is here to kind of help some of these countries to get rid of that bottleneck. Then again, Dola says that actually some African countries have acknowledged that they need to improve their infrastructure for them to clear supply bottlenecks and also get their goods in and out of the country easily. And from what we see, Africa is growing. Interestingly, is one of the continents that didn't slide back too badly within the COVID period. And just pre-COVID growth rates were up to 4.1%. I need to check and see if they were able to achieve that. That was only for 2021, so I can only hope that's been achieved. And when we see the growth rates according to what the Sustainable Development Goals, what what was I going to say? When we see what the Sustainable Development Goals ideas were set, we see that there is an annual investment gap of 2.5 trillion. This is for developing economies. So that means that we still have a big gap to fill up and cover these investments for Africa to realize economic growth and development. So we see that China has come in, realized there is a gap in Africa, and it's come in and decided to fund some of these investments so that Africa can realize and clear this gap. According to Financial Times in 2019, they said that Chinese investments increased so much that if you compare it with the US investment, it came from 2% in 2000 to 55% of US investment, which is quite a big chunk. And some of it we see is come from their consistency with the Forum on Africa Cooperation Summits, which despite COVID and everything, the summit in Dakar still was undertaken, much as it was on a smaller scale, but they still set out their post-COVID recovery plans, as well as promoting themselves favorably to the African continent. Then again, we see that China agreed indeed to take part within the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, which was an initiative that was brought about to help struggling countries, either whether they are in distress or near distress or just managing the loans just fine. Instead of paying China, they decided to divert the funds to cater for the health budgets within their economies. And many countries actually signed up for this program. Just before it was concluded, Development Reimagined had advocated for its extension. And of course, G20 and China realized that this is needed. And they recently decided to start off the common framework, which is basically the extension of DSSI, but countries apply, and depending on what the country is going through and what sort of help they needed, they extend this help. And so far we see Zambia, Chad, and Ethiopia have applied for it successfully. And yeah, so far they are managing the debt just fine. In addition, China also has committed to help some of the developing countries that may be in distress. That's using 10 million. That's part of their shares within the special drawing rights. So it is helping, but yet again, it doesn't stop the debts. The debts roll on. It's only just a debt relief, which is still helpful. And as well, reason as well why China is in Africa is because Africa is well endowed in natural resources. There's lots of minerals, oil, natural gas, the forests. Wildlife is a bit controversial. So, but then again, it's an endowment, so it brings in tourism. So some authors have concluded that China's investments could actually be more in Africa simply because of the availability of all these resources. And we see Aberagun and Manyiruka in 2020 as they looked at China's power in Africa, asking why Chinese have a lot of power within the continent, and they realize that it's because they are here to take advantage of the natural resources because they need them back home, and this will help them to get their factories going while they give debt or loans to Africa. Then also we see that Shin in 2020, as he was giving a testimony under the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission, he says that China actually sees Africa as a source of potential materials for their factories. Not only that, once they produce their products, they see Africa as a market for their exports. So for them, it's both ways. They get inputs, and then they end up selling the outputs back to the African countries. Then also Chen et al., as they looked at the distribution of Chinese ODI in 49 African countries, they discovered that most of investments from the Chinese in Africa is in oil and minerals. Though they argue that in some countries that might not be the case. We see them citing examples of South Africa, Ethiopia, and Kenya, saying that they have other strategic relationships that are different from the need for natural resources. Additionally, when we look at the 2015 IMF report, it says that when they looked at the investments that China had undertaken between 1995 and 2013, most of this investment was in abundant, rich countries in minerals and oils. And they also support the idea that, yes, China invests more in countries that are rich in natural resources. Additionally, ours in 2013 says that not only is China investing in minerals here, some of their companies are actually acquiring equity in some of the oil companies, for example, in Angola, Sudan, Uganda, and Ethiopia. But because they're kind of not wholly owned by them, the other share that's for the local country ends up getting used as security for further concessional loans, which is worrying because eventually they might lose total control in case of any defaults. And before that, Foster and his colleagues as well, as they looked at China's growing influence in the infrastructure sector within Africa, they discovered that there is a high correlation between African countries that are high in natural resources than the others. And they see that Chinese ODI is higher in those countries. The third theme that we identified is the sustainable economic development. Many countries all over the world now have these goals as part of their agendas. So this agenda was agreed upon in 2015, and it's to help countries come out of poverty, and they're focusing on just everybody, the people, the planet, and prosperity. And these goals are based on all the sectors, economic, social, and environmental factors. Through this, the countries have to work together to make sure that they achieve these goals and boost growth, social inclusion, and environmental protection. So for SDGs, many of the countries include these SDGs within their national development plans. And once the plans are drawn up and published, the lenders come into the market to advertise themselves and say, you know, you need to do this. We can help you either fund or construct, or maybe just fund, and you find your own contractors. So this is another way how China identifies how some of these countries need the help by going through their national development plans. Theme number 4 is China as a global power. As we see, China started gaining strength in 1978, but it's only become so significant in the last years, especially as they joined the World Trade Organization. With this, they promoted their going out policy, which included cross-border trades, as well as foreign direct investment, and they undertook different projects, infrastructure or construction projects in different countries. And with this exposure, we see that China's exports grew by 10.8%, which is just within that period from when they joined the WTO in 2001 and 2015, which is quite a big shift. But not only have their exports grown, their imports have also grown within that same period by 6% to cater for the need for production, higher production within China itself. So as we see post-financial crisis in 2008, the Chinese government looked at ways of recovering from this, and it decided to loosen its monetary policy and as well expand on the cross-border investments. And as they did this, investments have grown a lot, especially following the FOCAC in 2015. We see that China committed a lot of 13 billion to the African continent. And the year after, they committed 28.3 billion, which has actually been the highest commitment to date. This is a report by Brotigan. So we see that much as there is these significant increases indeed in their demand for resources and energy, we see that China has become the largest importer. By 2013, they were the largest importer of petroleum. Not only that, their crude oil imports as well grew by 8.4 barrels, which was higher than the US imports by 0.5 barrels a day. And this is only by 2017. So I'm sure right now it's a lot higher. But as this relationship indeed between Africa and China has grown, since there are some pressures from other powers like the European Union and United States. There's been a war, silent war that's going on between China and the United States, and some people have dubbed this the Cold War. We see an author there, Dupont, says this has become the new Cold War. But we'll see. They're still striving to see who becomes the global power. But the way China is going, I wouldn't be surprised if this happens in the next 2 years. Then something else that has boosted the Chinese presence on the world stage is the Belt and Road Initiative. This is why they've undertaken different projects in all over the continent since its inception in 2013. This is the aim to revive the historic routes that were previously there between themselves, Europe, Africa, and Middle East. And with this idea, they've undertaken lots and lots of projects all over the continent. And this has led to their higher growth. We see that in 2017, the trade deals between Africa alone and China had grown by 4.1%, amounting to 170 billion, according to the Ministry of Commerce in China. Another strand that's identified here is the funding model, which is called the China model. This is where the main one that they use actually for many of the projects, and the recipient country and China agree a fixed loan contract price. And once they've agreed to it, there is some collateral, of course, that the country has to stake just in case of any issues. And Jelpan says that the way they do this recently is packaging it as a special purpose vehicle. So that way the government is actually lending to that special purpose vehicle, and that could explain why some of these loans are not reflected on the balance sheets of the government. And the loans, the repayments are either in natural resources or revenues from the undertaken projects, or sometimes from the treasury. This slightly replaces the previous model, the Angola model, which was prevalent in the 90s going into the early 2000s, where loans were exchanged for commodities. It's not completely depleted. In Congo, they still do that sort of arrangement. It's loans for commodities, but the majority of the loan deals are signed using this new China model. And the main delivery method that they use is the engineering, procurement, and construction, whereby once a company is contracted, they undertake the project, they design the project, procure the materials, and construct the project, and they get paid on completion of the project. Recently, the State Council Information Office of the People's Republic of China has been advising their enterprises to undertake these investments using some various integrated models that will boost investment and also help Africa towards sustainable development. And one of these is the public-private partnership, where a few private entities come into collaboration and undertake certain projects. Currently, the Nairobi Highway has been constructed under a similar PPP model. Then the other model is the build, operate, and transfer. This is like the main model that they use for many of these projects. So the company comes in, funds the project, builds whatever the facility is, and then they agree a period of operation. So for some, it could be as less as 30 years. For the others, like seaports, it could be as many as 99 years. We see an example here with the previous Tanzanian president. He couldn't agree to the Bagamoyo port because China had wanted an operation period of 99 years, but he insisted on 33 years. And currently, this deal is still on the table as the new president tries to negotiate for better contracts. The other model that they use is build, own, and operate. This is for some projects that might require highly intensive technical skills that are not immediately available in Africa. For this case, they build the facility, own it for a concessional period. And once the period is finished, they could either apply for an extension, or if maybe at the time the technology has transferred well enough to the local population, then they hand over the project. But that's a very, very rare occurrence. So with these models, indeed, many commercial players have come into the market, and where there says by 2019, these Chinese private companies accounted for more than 70% of these investments, simply because the governments don't want the debts reflected on their balance sheets. So many of these deals are now signed with private companies, and this is how everything is happening. Then the other thing we identified is the institutional infrastructure in African countries. As it is, before anything else, many African countries have poor infrastructure structures, and this is based off of the fact that there is high levels of corruption. We see that the Corruption Perception Index in 2020 scored Africa 32%, bearing in mind 0 is highly corrupt. So Africa is only averaging about 32%. So which means that before anything is agreed, there is likelihood that there will be some slight corruption along the way. Additionally, CARI in 2021 also says that Chinese investments tend to be prevalent in economies that are politically unstable, as well as those that have weak and institutional systems, simply because they know that they don't have the technical teams to go through the negotiation terms and understand them. And for that matter, of course, that way, China ends up with a higher advantage compared to those countries. In addition to that, Sierra and Greece, Kraft and Merix. This is 2020 for Sierra Leone, and the other one is 2009. As I looked at fiscal structures within countries, they discover that actually because of poor infrastructure, it leads to poor fiscal structures. And in the end, this results in fragmented systems where there are no streamlined methods of accounting for these funds. And this, in the end, of course, impedes economic growth. And this, though Roderick says in 2016, he says, yes, you might have the institution of infrastructure, but it cannot happen independently. It cannot help economic growth independently. So other factors have to come into play, yes. And I was told this as I undertook my field work. The accountability mechanisms might be there. They will use them, yes. But that doesn't mean that behind the report, you know, everything is clear. Everything is still going on, but the report will come out to say that they've done what they've done. So indeed, I think I agree with Roderick on that. Kamodi and Krogelang as well, as they looked at the power relations between Zambia and Angola and China, they discovered that there's a lot of structural deficiencies within Africa, and they say that these have to be improved if Africa is to realize agency. And this is supported by Kodonga and Oja in 2016, who said that if the economy is to realize economic growth, indeed, they must improve the quality of the institutions. Something else as well that intervenes with the African agencies, the political influence. And we see Saul here in 2020 investigating why Africa has a lot of Africa +1 summits, whether it's Africa, Russia, Africa, France, Africa, EU, Africa. We recently had Africa, UK. So she says that some of these presidents like getting invited to such Africa +1 simply to boost their presence on the world stage, regardless of what the needs might be for their countries. Then also Goodfellow and Hung in 2020, as they looked at infrastructure and urban capital in filling this infrastructure gap, they find that African governments don't have exact systems to cater for the needs of this sort of arrangement, where you find it's the central government that has agreed to the deal, and they forget to involve the local leaders at district level or even like sub-county level. And before they know it, it's difficult to actually disseminate information from the central government to the local residents, which indeed brings about confusion. And in some cases where residents have to be displaced, this becomes a big issue as well. We had a similar situation in Nairobi with the Lamu project, where residents rioted because of this sort of displacement without prior information through local channels. Then Dreha in 2019 also, as he looked at the Africa's leaders' geographical regions in relation to the Chinese investments, he discovers that some of these presidents actually undertake projects that will benefit them. So that way, maybe if they lose the election, at least they'll have done something for their local area and they can go back and retire in that area. And they see that this, of course, in the end, bothers the clear vision of the project because it's focused on one person's political ambitions rather than the whole country. Then we also saw some election pressure in election period. Some governments undertake certain projects so they can present them in time for elections. We have an example in Kenya where Otel says that the Kenyatta's government overrode certain government rules and regulations simply to quicken the construction of the SGR in time for the elections. And recently there is rumors as well that the Nairobi highway is the same thing. The incumbents want the project finished so that they can present it in time for the August election this year. So there is still a lot of political influence in some of these investment projects. So then we got to the negotiating power of the African countries, which is also under agency. And GELPAN, this is a study actually that was so popular at the time it came out. This was 2021. And she looked at 100 contracts that have been signed worldwide. She was lucky enough to land onto these contracts. And she discovers that the ones that she saw, some of them had very unusual clauses for African governments or any other government, because she looked at all the governments in the world. And she says some of them have clauses that actually make it difficult for the local, for the country to pay back the loans. Not only that, some clauses give China an upper hand in that they can cancel loans if they've agreed to maybe fund a project and you've invested money already, feasibility studies, and you have maybe paid for the displacement of people. They can decide to cancel the loan without any explanation. Not only that, in some cases, they might even demand full repayment. If, let's say, maybe the government disagrees with them, they might demand full repayment ahead of schedule, which could be a problem as well. The fact that that money will come out of, will not have been previously budgeted for. And this indeed, if they're not able to pay, then China has an upper hand and it could affect the domestic and foreign policies of that local country. Then we see Standen and Wu as well, as they looked at African agency against the BRI projects. They say that they can see the African agency in the projects that they surveyed is actually present, but it has some limitations. And because this topic has become highly topical, they're asking African governments to try and use this chance to see if they can negotiate for better loan conditions that will not leave them indeed heavily indebted to China. Then additionally, Phillips, as he looked at who's in charge of the Sino-African political relations, looked at Ghana's projects, and Anthony looked at Kenya. And they said that African governments actually have the ability to negotiate for favorable conditions for these projects if they are to avoid debt distress. Though Phillips says that in some areas, agency is limited, especially with the economic structures. But on the political front, yes, they are strong enough. But when it comes to discussing economic structures, China has an upper hand. And for that matter, of course, they end up with unfavorable conditions. Then Sol as well, she wrote a blog on with the conversation. and she's writing about how Africa negotiates infrastructure projects with China. And in there, she says that some of the contracts that are agreed simply are agreed because they do not want China to take their investments elsewhere, and they agree to the terms and conditions, whether they are detrimental to the economy or not. Then we also see Seoul again. This report came out only recently, and she's looking at the loan contract conditions. She looked at Benin. Benin recently, well, in the last few years, constructed kind of like a city, but these negotiations started way back in 2006. A small country as it is, they took their time and looked at the clauses one by one and said to China, we cannot do this with you unless the conditions are revised to benefit us as well as you. And I think one of the conditions was that once they've built that economic area, they will not have any other economic area within a space of like 30 miles within it, which for the country, they said, no, we're growing. We need to be building and expanding. So if you stop us from expanding, what are we going to do? So the negotiations took a while, but eventually the Benin government indeed ended up with favorable conditions, which could be a lesson as well to other African countries. No matter how small or big you are, it's better to negotiate for those conditions that will, in the end, favor you. Yeah, they had several other conditions that were so not favorable. I think they needed their staff to come in but not pay any taxes for the duration of the concession period, which was about 30 years. So in the end, basically, they wouldn't gain anything. And as well, something else that I was asking recently, which I saw this Benin government do, is after the period of operation and they hand over the facility to the government, who's in charge of renovating it before the government takes it back? And I realized for many of the African governments, the refurbishment is actually billed to the government. But this Benin government insisted that the Chinese, before they hand over the facility, they have to renovate it on their budgets. And they actually agreed to that. So, which means that we can actually negotiate for better conditions for our countries if, we go through the clauses properly. We had another bad case in Uganda where recently the Minister for Finance openly said that if they had read the contract's conditions well enough, that's for the expansion of the Entebbe Airport to the 2015 contract, they said that if they had read every single clause carefully, they would not have signed the contract. So to me, the Benin case is a very, very good example. Regardless of how small or big a country you are, you can negotiate actually for better conditions for your country. Then we see, in addition, Nantulia, as he looked at reshaping African agency in these African China relations, he says what impedes some of the benefits out of these projects is because it's not transparent. And he says the negotiation process needs to be transparent from the get-go. That way, the countries, those who are not well enough at negotiating, can learn from each other. And in the end, as one process takes place after another, they kind of package like best practices that they can follow to improve on the negotiation process. Theme number 8 as well, we look at the debt trap diplomacy. This has been highly debated and written about, with many accusing China of leading Africa into a debt trap. And one of these who looked at this is Kamodi in 2020. And he says that, yes, much as they say that China is leading Africa into a debt trap, it's more of a dependence more than a debt trap. And this can be explained by the build, operate, transfer, because for the period of the operation period, China will actually be stationed in that country until the loan period finishes, then they can hand over. So if, let's say, you have a 99-year lease, that means China is with you for those 99 years. Which is detrimental. And as well, not only that, there's no revenue streams coming into the government. Everything that's coming out is going to China. So there's a lot of capital flight, especially with these projects. So he says that, yes, there's definitely very high levels of dependence. And we see like the SGR, even till today, still making losses. So that means for, how many years has that been now? 2018. They've not been able to pay anything back from this project. They're using treasury income, which of course in the end will extend the repayment period. And that means that China will stay longer within that country, hence the dependence argument. Then we also have Haley, Morris, and Portelens in 2019. They looked at projects that were undertaken by the Chinese, and they say that yes, actually, they might be burdening some countries, especially low-income countries. They might be burdening them with unsustainable debts, and most of this debt, of course, gets shifted to the taxpayer. And in the end, I suppose this is how we see the cost of living going higher and higher. And this is supported by Santosh. Santosh says that yes, China is, he looked at Zambia as a case study, and he says, yeah, some of it could explain China's spiraling debt. As well, Moody in 2018, they were looking at how China lends in sub-Saharan Africa. And they say that much as we see, yes, there is some levels of economic growth, but there is higher risks behind that economic growth. First of all, the debt servicing is very high. And the fact that as well, they are using natural resources to pay, they are depleting the economy. So the economy doesn't have enough money to cater for itself. And at the same time, all the revenues are going to China, which of course in the end will impede, in the end, economic growth. Then the other strands of literature we've had under the debt trap diplomacy is those debunking this debt trap diplomacy. And one of those is Singh. Singh looked at all the countries in the world where this debt trap diplomacy has come about. And he says that some of it is the US's anxiety. That's why we have a lot of negative media stories, especially about China's growing influence. And he says the projects that he looked at, one being the Sri Lanka, the Hambantota port, as well as the Kenyan port. He says no, there's no issues with debt trap or seizure, asset seizure reports. This is also supported by Brotigam. Brotigam looked at Angola, Djibouti, Sri Lanka, and Venezuela. And she also disagrees with these asset seizures and says that China doesn't deal in this sort of thing. They should actually do academic research to confirm this. Recently, this is only this month, she brought out another report. This is in relation to the Mombasa port, which some reports had said that they've staked it, saying that the SGR is making losses. The Chinese now have taken over Mombasa port to recoup their funds. But she says, no, this is not the case, and it was never used as collateral for SGR. Additionally, we have Jones and Hameri, who are from Chatham House, and they also looked at Sri Lanka and Malaysia and find that Chinese are not actually a major driver of debt distress. And they say that the host countries themselves have a role to play in agreeing what they can pay back and what they cannot pay back. So it's not all China's fault. This is supported by Were. Were is one of our economists in Kenya. She says that much as Chinese engagement in Africa has been met with some xenophobia, on the other hand, African countries have the ability to negotiate for what's affordable for their countries, and they shouldn't blame China for the debt distress. And then last, this is the last strand about sovereign debt, transparency, and accountability. And Brotigam and Huang in 2021 were trying to understand why we have a lot of underreported debt. And they discovered that, first of all, there's just general failure for borrowing countries to consistently report. It's not a compulsory requirement for them to report to World Bank. And for that matter, some do it, others don't. Then another reason could be that the World Bank lacks actually the power to force them to report. So year by year, one country might report today, maybe next year they don't report, then another country might not give in any reports at all. So there's huge inconsistencies in debt reporting with the World Bank, which ideally, if the countries got together and agreed, could be a good idea to track levels of debt in Africa. But as it is, it's not compulsory. So we've seen Jelpan before, when she did her analysis on the 100 Chinese contracts. These were between 2015 to 2019, based on developing countries. She discovers that actually 100% of them that were signed within that period, all of them had confidentiality clauses. So which means that the recipient country was not allowed to share the details of the loan contract. And for that matter, of course, this adds to the lack of knowledge on these debt contracts. And as well, nobody knows as well at any one point how much one country is indebted. One country that has secured a loan from China, it's not easy to ascertain exactly the percentage of debt that they owe, either to China or anybody else, because it's hidden. Then Phillips as well, in 2019, he looked at Ghana since the exploration of oil, and with the Ghanaian companies and the Chinese, this is the Ghanaian subcontractors, as well as the Chinese contractors, he discovers that there is no accountability. This is actually the only study that I've found so far that deals directly. Even then, it's not all of it on accountability, it's just a section of it on accountability. And he says that both contractors on either side did not have any track of the costs of the project, which is, of course, a big issue, especially in terms of weighing up if the projects have brought about enough benefits compared to the loan repayments that go back to China. Then Were in 2018 also says that in addition to this vagueness of data, there is also the fact that some of these investments are affected by diversion of funds to unintended purposes, as it is because it's not documented. Most likely, maybe before it comes into the government, a big chunk might be cut off to somebody else, and nobody will know until it gets scrutinized. Another addition to this, we have Kimiyo and Zan in 2018, as they looked at the fiscal transparency in 33 emerging and developing countries. They discovered that there is a positive correlation between fiscal transparency and borrowing costs, in that once the lenders are aware of your ability to repay the loans, most likely they're able to negotiate better, and as well the recipient country is in position to argue themselves to better favorable conditions. This is supported as well by Bastilda with his colleagues, who looked at a sample of 103 countries worldwide, and they say, yes, they can see there's a correlation between fiscal transparency and sovereign debt financing, saying that once there is fiscal transparency and the players in the market know exactly the ability, the credit risk attached to that very country, it might actually have an impact on the cost of sovereign debt. This support as well for this comes from Choi and Hashimoto in 2018, who looked at 52 emerging markets, economies, and find that, yes, once there is transparency, the market participants react positively to this news, and which means that this will lead to better trade and investment choices between the lenders in the markets and the recipient countries. So we look at what's been the impact of these Chinese loans in Africa. And we realize here, we see the President Xi Jinping in 2018 reiterated saying that China is in Africa to help improve the lives of the people and to benefit both China and Africa. Their relationship till to date is still promoted as a win-win, and we do hope that indeed eventually it is. And we see WHO, EU, and SEOC in 2021 as they investigated the impact of FDI on technology. This is in developing markets. They sampled 24 countries, and they discovered that between 2006 and 2017, Chinese FDI had a positive and significant impact, especially on the technological progress in Africa. Then we have several studies, and here, many of them looked at economic transformation, FDI, integration, industrialization, diffusion of economic activity, economic growth, infrastructure, economic performance, production, as well as China, the basic China-Africa relations. So all of these studies in the middle here, Calabrese, and Tang, Yu et al., Lambo, and the rest, all of them find that China brings in positive benefits for the economy, and these positive benefits end up boosting economic growth and development. Additionally, this Motorano in 2019, he looked at the inputs of Chinese investments. We saw the hospital in Senegal. So in some countries, the Chinese government has funded some health-related projects, and they said that actually the projects that they have funded have positively contributed to the health improvement of these economies. In here, they cite that in areas where they've put certain projects, they find that there's like reduced malaria cases, as well as improved general health, maternal health within those communities. But then on the other hand as well, we have some that argue slightly differently. We see Schnovel, German, and Gumbo in 2014. They argue that yes, Chinese investments contributed to Zambia's economic recovery within the time that they funded the project. But on the other hand, they also said that it could lead to issues of repayment, the fact that there's a lot of capital flight between Zambia and China. Then also Jaroskilu and Jut in 2020, as they looked at Chinese economic involvement in Africa, they said that yes, they can see that China benefits more from this relationship than the African countries, simply because they need to access these resources for their inputs in their factories. And not only that, then they end up exporting the goods back to Africa. So there's a lot of, yet again, capital flight out of Africa, which of course in the end doesn't contribute to economic growth as much as it should. Then another study by Kinyondo, he did a case study on Tanzania, and he says that he was asking the question, is China colonizing Africa? But he looked at a case study on Tanzania. And from his study, you can see that actually there's a lot of natural resources that get exported to China. If you compare this to the FDI inflows, and for that matter, of course, he says, yes, China is a bigger beneficiary in this relationship. Not only that, there is use of Chinese labor in these projects compared to like the local human capital. Though now I've been told for many countries this used to be the case, but as they caught on and discovered that they can have higher negotiating power, they are getting better at limiting the number of Chinese employees coming into the countries. For some, it's still quite high, but for the others, they are managing the numbers just fine. Then we have also Oya and Shofa in 2019. They looked at Chinese firms' employment dynamics in Africa to see if at all indeed this narrative is correct to say that they bring in all their employees on these projects at the detriment of local employees. And they discovered that in some projects, for example, in Ethiopia, there was some Ethiopians in managerial positions. and which meant that, yes, the Chinese are extending skills to the local population, the skills transfer, but they said that this may not be the case in other countries. For example, they looked at Angola in the same study, and it wasn't the case in Angola. It was only the very low-skilled employees that were local employees. The rest of them were Chinese nationalities. Then as well, Schnovel, German, and Gumbo, as we saw above in 2014, as they look at the Sino-African relations in Zambia, they said that from what they can see, the Chinese companies trade between themselves. Maybe they might need a raw material, but another investor will come into the country to provide that raw material. So you find that they have vertical and horizontal dealings between themselves, and there's not that much linkages with the local companies. And of course, this means that there's literally no technological or skills transfer between themselves and the local population. And in the end, the project benefits are minimalized. So what can we conclude from this? We see that, yes, Chinese loans, especially in Africa, are steady, but they're declining. Reasons for this are yet to be known, but like I said previously, it could be the two reasons. Maybe because China has been scrutinized a lot, or it could be the fact that the African governments themselves have realized that their debt is becoming very unsustainable, and for that matter, both parties have pulled back. But then we also said that we also see that most of this debt is being contributed by the new lenders, commercial lenders into the market, which have higher interest rates compared to like what the Chinese government would give to a recipient country. Something else we see as well, the negotiation skills within these countries, they need a lot of improving. For some of them, they actually send politicians rather than the technical people who understand the contents of the contract. So there's need for like negotiation teams. At least each country should have a negotiation team to sit and negotiate these contracts. So next one we see doing this, we realize there's still very low literature on the impact of these loans on sovereign debt accountability and transparency. And this is especially in the context of sustainable economic development, but more so in highly indebted and as well as low to middle income countries. Furthermore, we need to investigate the mechanisms these different countries use to, first of all, maintain the loans and manage it well as to report it so that the other lenders in the market are aware of how risky or not risky that country is as a recipient debtor. So doing this, hopefully, will help clear some of these gaps, the academic gaps that have been identified, especially by Deborah Protigam. She's one of the leading scholars, like I mentioned before, in this Sino-African relations. She says that there's still very low literature. Most of it that's written is not really all that academic, and we need to understand this better. And not only that, yes, write the academic literature, but try to bridge it with the policymakers so they can understand where the problem is, and that way governments can become aware and negotiate better, and the loans can be managed well. And that's the end. Thank you, everyone. And since this is a work in progress, I welcome your comments. Every single comment is kindly welcome, and this will support me to go through to the next stage of my thesis. Thank you.
Thank you indeed, Catherine. We give you a hand of applause. As you can see, definitely a very interesting discussion, a comprehensive coverage of the main issues. In fact, the amount of literature you went through is absolutely phenomenal, and identifying up to 9 interesting themes, 9 interesting arguments, all the way from the investment gap argument, which is testable, empirically, the African natural resources, component, which again could be tested independently. Of course, the sustainable economic development argument, which could be even tested simply in terms of the correlations and the statistical associations between China's participation in the country, and also whether if there's a control group, whether that's leading sustainable economic development compared to other donors or even lenders. The global position, again, that's the agency theory, considerations, the financing models used, the institutional infrastructure, negotiating power, again, that could be, again, tested. There are different measures. The debt trap diplomacy, and of course, you ended up with the observation about the relationship between sovereign debt transparency and accountability, adding some of the work that was done on the correlation between fiscal transparency and borrowing costs. So you've actually uncovered a huge amount of work. I'm not sure whether you'll be able to cover all these interesting hypotheses in your next step of empirical work, but you won't be running short of ideas. You'll cover as much as you can and leave the rest for other investigators to investigate. Okay, so what I'll do now is open up the discussion, comments from the floor. Let me see, in terms of hands up, there are no hands up as such. So let me invite, yes. So the first hand up is from Doug, a professor of practice at SOAS and also at ODI. So I'll invite Doug, and then after that, Anthony, and then Richard. So Doug, you go first. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Victor, very much, and thank you, Catherine, for an excellent presentation. And I'm sorry that I joined a bit later, so I didn't see the start, but I definitely looked at all the sort of the areas that you mapped out and very carefully considered all the evidence that exists around these themes. And I think I've got sort of one suggestion and one question. I suppose so if you're interested in the impact of Chinese loans on Africa, then from what I gathered from most of the points that you raised, the terms of contract are really important for you, so that the impact of the loan depends partly on the terms. And you say there's some agency, there may be less in some circumstances and more in others. And I think that's a very fruitful area of further research, and would encourage you to think through that as well. I think when you talk about SDR, I think one additional factor may be important as well, and whether maybe it's just an exogenous variable for you, or something you may want to look into in more detail, is the complementary actions that are taking place. So I think on the SDR, from what I understand in Kenya, is that it cost 4 billion. It should have cost 2 billion. There are lots of issues around this, and it wasn't immediately needed or immediately used. I remember 2017, I was just a tourist. I used it, and it was quite nice to use. But of course, we want it to be used more heavily, and particularly business. And I think the idea was that the whole line would make sense if it was extended quickly to other countries, but also if it was used not just for importing but also for exporting, and so that all these special economic zones that had been thought that would be placed around the SDR would actually then produce goods, and which then could be used by the SDR, so that sort of and also be used for export as well. So the point is basically then is that yes, it could be costly, but if it is actually used much more to export as well, and then it probably could have made more money, and it could make more sense. So and some countries are good at placing special economic zones, others are not. So then the point, and that's perhaps a wider point, is the context within which these loans have an impact depends, yes, on the contract terms, but also on what else is being put in place and the complementary actions that are put in place, and that some countries are very good at that and others are not. So maybe that's something you want to comment on as well. And I say that because I mean, I think the evidence that you also bring to the fore is that maybe Chinese investment isn't that different from other foreign investment anymore in Africa. But I think there was one area where I thought there was quite a big difference, which was about linkages, and that there weren't that many vertical spillovers from FDI, Chinese FDI, into the domestic economy because the linkages aren't that extensive, and that other foreign investors have more developed linkages, perhaps because Chinese investment is only there for a short period of time so far, in some cases, not all. So the linkages, of course, depend also on complementary factors. So I think we might be seeing there that the complementary factors are really important. That over time the impact of the Chinese loans and investment could be bigger, particularly when complementary actions are put in place. So what we'll be interested to hear from you, whether that's an area that you're going to look into, and or how you're going to account for that in your framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derek.
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. This is actually, but it's good you raised the point of the SGR. I spoke to some people who use it in Nairobi. I was told because they check in it's almost similar check-in as an aeroplane. So first of all, it takes a lot of time. Secondly, there are increased costs because they have to transport whatever their goods are to the terminal. From the terminal as well, clearing charges as well. So you find businesses do not use the SGR at all for transportation, simply because the costs are way higher than if they used a truck, for example, from Mombasa to Nairobi. So this is some of the problems as well. I don't blame China. Something like that could have been part of the feasibility study to see if at all we have this sort of thing. Did they survey the local traders to see are they in position enough to use these services? So in a way, it's the governments, our governments, I think naturally they get excited about these projects, but in the end, they forget that these are investments projects that are actually supposed to bring in profits that benefit the general population. Then another problem we have with some of these rail lines, I was told the reason why their terminals are so far out of the city is for security measures. So, but then again, because of the security, that brings about, then again, the inconvenience to the users. And in that case, hardly anybody uses it. It's leisure travelers that use it. So it's a big problem. I will discuss it, but I don't know how far deep I can go into it, but it's definitely a problem. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Derek, and thank you, Catherine, for the response. It is something that I think could be looked into, especially in terms of scoping for some case studies to be done down the line. Okay, Anthony, you are next.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you, Prof, and thanks for a very useful and insightful presentation. A lot of information. The question I have is around the win-wins that you made reference to, and when one party says it's a win-win, the one party can only talk to one win. The other party should talk for the other win. And so the question that I have is, for many of the African countries, when these contracts are being designed, before it's being signed, is there an idea of what constitutes a win, for the country, so that becomes very clear, and then one can talk about a win-win. At least that would be a win for Africa. And to me, it really comes down to information. I don't know, Prof, you were at the ADB. I was at the ADB at some point. One big challenge that we had with with these projects, infrastructure projects, even with the ADB, was to fund cross-border projects, bigger projects. And so you just have these national projects, and clearly, given the institutional challenges and given the skills, you are at a disadvantage as an African country having to negotiate with a very big partner. Perhaps a solution would be having more players in the game and having skin in the game, so that the information is more transparent, and one is then in a position to measure the impact of these projects post implementation. Because you see the discussion really around at the launch, and everyone focuses on launching, but the real benefit to society is what happens post the launch of a project. And so that really is my question. Is there an idea of what constitutes a win? And because it's public finance, in theory, and there's a lot of, the theories from the Bailey 2004 will talk about the 4 E's in public finance, that the money must be used efficiently, it must be used effectively, it must have an equity benefit, and there's the economy. And so those would be, if those are defined upfront in a win situation for African states, then in those areas, then it becomes clearer what it is we target, and we know when we fail or when we win. So that would be my comment. Thanks, Prof. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Anthony. I like your contribution, and in a way, pushing for even an empirical investigation of expectations, initial expectations and negotiations, and then ex post evaluation of where these expectations were met. So in a way, you are framing something empirical for Catherine, but let me ask Catherine to weigh in, and yeah, thank you indeed. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. It's an interesting one. The win-win is quite interesting. In fact, one of the accounting officers here in Uganda told me that at the moment they haven't done anything to see if at all the Chinese investments are bringing in as much benefits as they expect. For the local population, some of them not really, because some of the projects they've undertaken are still going through implementation stages. Let's say with the Isimba hydropower, they have constructed it, but because they're still going through putting electric poles and electric wiring all through the districts, at the moment, they don't know. It hasn't done anything for them to actually see if it's helping the locals. Where else? In Zambia, yes, the road network is functional, the airport is functional, but then again, I was told it's too early to assess if the locals are benefiting as much as possible. So on the win-win on the African side, it's not coming out as strongly at the moment because, like I said, many of them use that build, operate, transfer. So while they are still within that concession period of, I don't know, 30, 40, 50, even up to 99 years, they'll actually never know if they are benefiting because they're not actually bringing in any revenue into the country, which is a very, very big issue. But I'm told little by little they're realizing this and they are trying to find ways of trickling something back into the economy. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine, and yeah, Anthony, for raising an important point. And maybe, Catherine, you should share the full paper after the seminar, because in that paper you have you go into the game theory of explaining how the win-win works, and to a game theoretical exposition of who wins and who loses. That could really underpin the way of explaining the win-win. And then there could be a simple empirical test of a win-win in terms of looking at the expectations ex ante and then ex post for some of the projects that have already been implemented, whether some of these benefits are really are being realized. A case study or two, I think, would help demonstrate the reality or the empirical realization of the win-win, which is a game theoretical setting, basically. So a good point there. Richard.
Thank you, Catherine. Well done. First of all, a few questions and comments. So, yeah, the SGR in Kenya. A lot of, as we've discussed before, there are overlaps between some of the issues with the SGR and with China's own project, the Shanghai Maglev, which has, again, it's expensive. It goes to one of the terminals is Shanghai's airport, but the other one is the suburbs. It doesn't go right into the city center. So it's interesting in terms, it would suggest that China's not using the SGR to dominate Kenya, but possibly the same mistakes are being made. So that's something you might consider. On the other hand, in terms of the wider use of the SGR, I remember you telling me from your fieldwork in Senegal that, again, there's the old road, which is toll free, and then there's the Chinese financed highway, which has a toll on it. And you were saying a lot of when the bus drivers ask the passengers, which way do you want me to go? A lot of them say, take the highway because it's faster. So maybe lessons could be learned from that. Maybe Kenya could learn from that. What else? Yeah, in terms of Benin having a tough round of negotiations, but turning it around and extracting concessions. And as I said in the chat, when you were talking about that, it occurred to me that Benin is maybe in a stronger bargaining position than some African countries because China exports minerals, including uranium, from Niger. And how does it get them? They come through the port of Cotonou. So that port and the fact that China needs a good a good problem-free exit route out of Niger could have been one of the cards that Benin held. And so again, possibly other African countries could learn from this and say, okay, on our own, we're not a massive player in town, except that we have a port through which China is exporting minerals and other things from the interior of Africa. So maybe if we got together, we're stronger than we thought we were. And in terms of getting together, that brings me on to the point about confidentiality. Clearly, a single African country, if they say, no, we're not prepared to agree to a confidentiality clause, they fear that China will turn around and say, well, in that case, we're not lending you the money. But if several African countries, or even the whole of Africa, may be following a directive, may be following advice from the African Development Bank or even the World Bank, said we're not going to agree to this. Perhaps if the African Development, this is more a discussion question, could the African Development Bank have a role in saying, we do not approve of confidentiality clauses in international loans, and we will find ways of making that disapproval practically felt. I wondered whether that might be a way forward. And then finally, just to clarify Professor Murinde's point earlier on about the Ding paper, it was published in 2022, but you say it looked at literature running up to 2017. And obviously a lot of the material you talked about was published after 2017. So those are my inputs.
Oh, thanks so much, Richard. I should have introduced Richard in full capacity. Richard is supervising the project by Catherine. Your comments are absolutely helpful. You have mentioned something, Richard, which hadn't come out in the discussion, and that is the fact we note that from the discussion by Catherine that it seems individual countries at a disadvantage in many ways in negotiating with the China partners, that a win-win may not actually happen. So what you are suggesting, Richard, makes a lot of sense. How about negotiating as a group? The African Development Bank, and Anthony did allude to this in a way. The African Development Bank provides some facilities because they have a legal unit which helps African countries to negotiate contracts. And so they could invoke support from the African Development Bank to help them negotiate some of the individual a contract, but also the African Union is a body that brings together African countries, and they do have this whole idea of African free intercontinental area. So I think there are some we would need to know a little bit, maybe when you start writing up, Catherine, in terms of whether the support that the African Development Bank, legal and negotiation office, and also the African Union, whether they support individual countries in their negotiations, and then give them a certain level of power in the negotiations. Yeah. Maybe, Catherine, I can invite you to say something here.
All right, thank you both. Thank you, Richard, for your comments. I've written everything down. Yeah, so the issue of yes, of course, with the countries, they're better better position to negotiate if they are, I don't know, as a bloc. Going into this, I was going for, you remember, I proposed a supervisory body under the AU. Everybody in Africa is telling me the AU has no teeth. Sorry. So it's never going to work on the AU level. If we use the regional blocks, yes, they might do, but on the other hand, they don't. They might not work. Then as well, even on regional bodies, there's an idea of having one country stronger than the other. They might end up opposing what the other country proposes. I think, was it Burundi and Kenya in East Africa have gone above the agreed debt threshold, yet going into the agreement, they had agreed not to go over it, but they've gone over it. So that was one example I was given. If we have agreed for this not to happen and it's happening, why are they not to oppose negotiations with China? They'll say this is our sovereign debt and we'll deal with it our way. But I do agree. I'll still propose at least we have a bloc, regional bloc negotiations rather than a single country on its own, which I think will definitely be helpful for some of these countries anyway. Yeah.
Thank you again, Richard and Catherine, for the responses. We go to Hong. Professor Bo has a great interest in studies on China and Africa. I've done a couple of influential papers, and mainly looking at the company corporate finance angle. So Hong, please go ahead and share with us your discussion.
Yes, okay, thank you very much, Victor, and thanks to Catherine for the presentation, very comprehensive. So I have I narrowed down my comments into two now, given the time. So I'm thinking about that discussion on the win-win, I heard when people say it is a win-win between China and Africa in theory, but in practice, it's China who is winning double times. Okay, so double wins for China. But then I was wondering what the reasons behind this type of, the debate. So first of all, why is China there? rather than other countries. Yeah. So yes, you talked about market-seeking orientation, particularly for China. It's resource-orientated, resource-seeking. But everybody is resource-seeking. Everybody needs market. So the question we need to go deeper is, why is China? Why China? Why African countries are willing to sign the contract with China, but not with conventional investors? So that's the first question. And secondly, if you apply the agency theory framework to this setting, I do not see the applicability of the conventional agency theory in this case. Think about it. In the conventional framework, as African government, you invite some private firms to come to your country, investing in your infrastructure, and you sign the contract. And the African government, country government, is the principal in this case. So the private firms are your agents. Okay, so we can apply the conventional theory to this setting. However, in the case of China, you are inviting, yes, in theory, it's an agent, but in fact, it's the state. It's the Chinese government, which is even more powerful than the principal. So I do not know whether this is a principal agent problem. Still, it may be something else. It's maybe so. So I think it's a lot of complication here. We need to really think about it. I do not know how to explain this. I work with Victor, with my PhD students. We are struggling with those kind of things. So that's one thing that I think I should maybe just a little bit of hint for people to go further. And when you are applying the standard theory, for example, the game theory, if you apply the game theory, normally we'll assume those two participants, they should be equal, right? But in this case, yes, if you say no, there's only, zero infrastructure in this country. Okay, so that's something that I would like to think more. In addition to this one, so my second comment is about your research actually. So and I think Victor mentioned something. So you covered so many different streams of literature. It is really, really helpful. I think for people who do not know about this China-African relationship, I think is when we read your literature review, it solves a lot of problems. But my question is, when you are doing a PhD thesis, what are your focus? What are your own research questions? So relating to these comments, my question to you at this stage, I think you are already in the second year, the end of the second year, so you need to think about what are your research questions. So now go back to the literature. So let me say, if I ask you to pick up 3 very important issues out of those 13 or 14 something. So what are those 3 things? So what do you think about it?
Thank you, Professor.
Sorry.
It's all right. So the 3 of them I'm focusing on would be debt transparency, the impact of Chinese loans on the debt transparency, the sovereign debt transparency in these countries. Then I'm also looking at the accountability, which is on the side of the African countries. How accountable are the African countries to their residents on these loans? Because everything now is blaming China for the debt distress. But what are the African countries themselves doing to help themselves? So that's another one I'm looking at. And the third one, I'd look at the impact on economic growth. Has it done anything between 2000 to date? Yeah, but yes, thank you. You raised very important comments there that I need to think of.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's right. As long as, I do not know what are the 3 priorities, but as long as you think they are important, you should focus on them rather than put your effort into everything. So, and I think that's very important here. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks so much, Hong. Very, very constructive suggestions. And just looking beyond the paper, that once this excellent literature review paper is done, completed, and published, then what is the next step forward? And a little bit of thinking, beyond that. And I like also your theoretical exposition when you were, checking that applying agency theory framework may be problematic. I agree. But using the question of asymmetric information may be absolutely relevant because basically the information set that Chinese negotiators have and the information set that local governments have is completely different. So there is a question of asymmetric information and how that may translate into borrowing costs or how that may distort the possibility of win-win. So I think even when Catherine pursued the 3 areas she mentioned, there will be some interesting theoretical as well as empirical work. Thank you very much. Now I see, I think there is a Doug again. Yes, please, come in again. Yeah.
I'm so excited about the discussion. So thank you for giving me a second chance, because it's really wonderful to get to have this very informative review. So I suppose, so methodologically there are a range of questions, of course, and of course an interesting question, a policy question, is around the impact of Chinese loans on African countries and whether there are win-win situations and so on. A deeper question is the impact of Chinese loans or Chinese investment different from other foreign loans and foreign investment? So that basically that in many cases, so Benin may have been able to do certain things. It may have been able to do those things for other flows as well, or not. And so I think it warrants a bit of a discussion. Not only thinking about what is the impact, but also is it different? Is the impact different? And it raises the bar a bit on the review, and that they're not necessarily, or it maybe sort of lead to further questions down the line. But I think that is basically that the perception has been in Africa. So 10 years ago was that Chinese investment and loans are so different. They and a debt trap narrative took hold, and that the Chinese investors don't use local employees and so on. And the question is that now still the case? And is it different? And I think that sort of review that you mentioned, like Carlos Oya and Linda Calabrese, Xiaoyang Tang, is that is not very different in some respects. But it would be interesting, on all the areas that you have highlighted, where is China, the impact of China, different? Is China, our governments really engaging differently with China than they would do with the US, the UK, or other investors, or South African investors? I don't want to sort of raise the bar too much, but it would be very interesting, I think, from a policy perspective, whether that's different.
Yeah, thanks, Dak, so much. As you are just mentioning this, I was just nodding and say this is gold quality. This is a gold quality contribution, because actually you could do this, by invoking experimental design studies. Experimental design in the sense that Catherine has visited a number of countries in Africa. Those will be the ones that she can focus on, and then set up an experiment of comparing them with the Chinese land with other lenders who are already active in these markets long before. So absolutely helpful. But before I ask Catherine to come in, our colleague Professor Sulai Tumwine from Makerere University Business School has been waiting for long, and then could I invite you, Professor Tumwine, to ask to make your contribution?
Okay, thank you so much, Professor, for giving me an opportunity, and thank you so much, Catherine, for your presentation. My question is actually builds on what Professor Hong raised. One, when you are doing a systematic literature review, as your topic suggests, I would want to see maybe at one time you informing the readers the comparative view of the China loans, a trend of the loans from China, maybe from USA and other developed countries that have been directed to Africa, the trend of what they have been directed towards and the extent of what they have achieved. Then secondly, in your literature review, I believe you are using progressive coherence. If at all you are using progressive coherence, like again in line with what Hong said, we need to see the lines of argument in the literature you are reviewing. When we get those lines of argument, then it is possible based on the lines of argument, we'll hypothesize or say the research questions. Now, you tell us gaps, you tell us theme 1, theme 2, up to 9 or 10, but you are not giving us a progressive coherence of the gaps or the arguments in literature from which the themes or from which the research questions and hypotheses actually stand. The moment that one is lacking, then we shall ask, where does she want to make a contribution? That must systematically come out. We see a review of paper XYZ. From these papers, they did not do the following, and therefore hypothesize as follows, on and on like that. Then apart from that progressive coherence of literature, from which gaps are identified, then the second is, I have seen several of your theoretical framework. I have seen the Coburn-Douglas, which talks about labor and capital. My question was, in this case, we are dealing with loans. How does labor apply? Maybe it is capital. So I expect that when you provide such a theoretical framework, then you have also to augment it. You have to argue about it, why it is appropriate, and on and on and on up the several models you develop or you have looked at. Then after those theoretical framework or models, then we want to see the Catherine model that she wants to move out there. Now the Catherine model is missing. I agree you have stated so many. One might ask, well stated, and so what? From the very many models, and your line of argument from the models, a critique or a support, then we'd like to see now the Catherine model down after the several of them. This is the Catherine model for which she wants to make contribution based on the existing literature review. Now, when all these are missing, then we shall say you are simply stating it becomes a very good story told, but and so what? The moment that hook is not coming out, you are going to keep the listeners waiting, and the question will be, and so what? And so what? And that is in line with the same thing I think Jules Anthony raised, and the same applied to Hong. So these must actually come out so that your study is very, very interesting. Then lastly, you are talking of projects, but the sustainable economic development arising from these projects are not seen. This is the same thing Anthony raised. They are more or less at commissioning, but how do we tap into the sustainable development that these loans have brought? The moment you don't take us further, it is as if loans are got invested. We have seen those good pictures you have brought up, very good, but then how sustainable? How have they contributed to the country's economic growth and development? You need to take it further. That's why I said we need a trend. The amount of loans since 2000, then what have they achieved? How have they contributed to Sub-Saharan African economic growth and development? Perhaps that would now start to incite the readers and on and on. I can stop there for now, Professor.
Thank you very much, Professor Tumwine. I agree completely with the important points you raised, and indeed, these should be factored into the 3 empirical papers that Catherine will embark on after this survey paper. Now, Catherine, I'll give you 1 or 2 minutes to react, and in the interest of time, we are just about 6 minutes remaining, but please let's react and also appreciate the great comments that we've received from the generosity of the participants. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh, I've unmuted. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Tumino, for your very useful comment. Yeah, I do realize your comments, and I take them on board. And actually, the next chapter of my thesis is discussing exactly what I've found and where I fit myself in. The reason why I haven't included it in here, because I'm proposing like general research for everybody. But in hindsight, it's actually, I'm doing it as a selfish thing. Yes, I have identified there's low research, especially on the impact of Chinese loans on debt sustainability and transparency in these economies. So I'm suggesting that, yes, research needs to be done in there, but I'm on the way. What I'm discovering now, I'll be writing about it in my next chapter. So yeah, but then again, like you mentioned, I need to streamline my theories to go hand in hand. The reason why I had labor and capital, because the Chinese provide both. They bring in the labor and the expertise. So it's difficult to take one without the other. That was the reason why I included that. But yes, I still have work to do, and I appreciate all your comments, and this will definitely enrich my next chapter in the thesis, as well as improving this chapter, of course, of my thesis as well. So thank you very much, everyone. And yes.
So once again, we give a hand of applause to Catherine for this exciting work she has developed and which she has been able to share with us today. I think the literature review paper, after a little bit of tidying up, will definitely hit a very good journal. And then we're actually looking forward later this year and for most of next year to be able to see a lot of the empirical work and see a lot of what she's been able to correct and the insights from the field work that she has undertaken across many African countries. I would like to thank all of you for making the time to be with us today and to participate in this CGF research seminar.